So in recent weeks, Larian has gone relatively silent, but not absolutely radio silent. We know that right now they are actively working on that special extended evil ending for Baldur's Gate 3, and they're definitely still going to be patching some things up in the game. Other than that, it has pretty much been confirmed that, yeah, they are done with Baldur's Gate 3. That, of course, was disappointing to many of us, but we have absorbed this information and we've come to terms with it for the most part. But I did say relatively silent, because despite this relative silence, Swen Vincke cannot contain his enthusiasm when it comes to his projects, meaning that he sometimes tweets out things that are, how should I put it, highly indicative of the things he's working on right now at his studio. Now, you might recall in an earlier video that I had alluded to the fact that this next big game they're working on is almost certainly science fiction. He talked about it last summer, about a year ago, saying, yes, we've always wanted to do a science fiction game. That's probably what we're going to be working on next. Before we got confirmation that they were not going to be working on DLC and that they would be moving on to new projects, Sven had tweeted out this image of a bunch of his workers on ice, and they were capturing ice in some northern climate. Now, initially, I thought this was an indication, incorrectly as it turned out, of a game they're working on, or a sequel, or a DLC that involved Icewind Dale. That was my logical conclusion based on the momentum and the information we had at the time. But now, I think somewhat differently. Now I think this was footage they were capturing related to some frozen, icy planet. And more importantly, a fairly recent tweet by Swen Vincke pretty much confirms that their next project is science fiction. He basically wants the world to know, hey guys, Larian is working on a science fiction game, so maybe you should start thinking about that. And the tweet was this, as you can see: the nebula is made of glass, and it's hard to take a good picture of it. So I asked our award-winning cinematic team for help. Now, why would he be referencing a nebula out of the blue for absolutely no reason? I think it would be a little odd if he's talking about nebulas, and he does not have any interest in making a science fiction game, and we already know he said he wanted to for years. So whatever they're working on is definitely science fiction. However, they are working on 2 games at the same time, and we know that they opened up a new studio in Poland, of all places. And of course, they probably need the extra manpower to be able to make 2 games simultaneously. It's not exactly easy. And as for the other game, my sense is, and this is just me speculating, that Sven wants to keep that game under wraps a lot more than this next science fiction project, which he's happily tweeting about, as we can say essentially nothing about this other game. With all of that said, I do have some thoughts on the prospect of a science fiction game made by Larian. Now, we know for a fact that they are working on their own IP, meaning that this science fiction game will be a Larian IP, whatever it ends up being called. And I think it's important to stress here that you really shouldn't underestimate the impact of D&D as a franchise, as an IP, as a decades-old tradition on Baldur's Gate 3 and its popularity. Of course, Larian made a fantastic game. I know, I covered the game quite a bit. I have over 1,000 hours in Baldur's Gate 3. That said, the fact that the game was fantastic and very good is not necessarily something that's relevant to the relative popularity of the IP. A lot of people got into Baldur's Gate 3 because of its predecessor games, Baldur's Gate 1 and 2, the fact that it was D&D, and the fact, of course, that Critical Role in the previous years had been building up the hype about tabletop and role-playing in general. So all these factors went into Baldur's Gate 3, which almost certainly added to the popularity of the game, and it definitely was a reason why the game was so beloved by many people. And I count myself among such people, because although I played both Divinity Original Sin 1 and 2, and I liked them, my like for those games does not compare to my like or love for Baldur's Gate 3, simply because Baldur's Gate 3 takes place in the Forgotten Realms within the context of D&D. So what does this mean for a future IP that's their own IP, a new IP? And I think you can guess. I think overall, the hype and the interest will be somewhat diminished compared to Baldur's Gate 3. And I don't mean that necessarily in a negative way, it's just that they're working on something completely new. They've never worked on sci-fi before, and it doesn't have the backing or reputation that Dungeons & Dragons had, namely 50 years plus of existing and being known to many, many people throughout the world. So although I think they're going to be really popular with their new game, I have no doubt about that because it's Larian, and with Baldur's Gate 3, they were able to onboard a lot of people that previously had no interest in CRPGs, mostly for the cinematics. I've talked about this extensively. Nonetheless, I think it's going to be somewhat different, and I don't think their next game is going to be quite as popular as Baldur's Gate 3. I could be wrong about that, but think about it. A completely new IP, and they've never worked on sci-fi before. Now, obviously, when it comes to fiction, there's always a lot of overlap overall, but sci-fi is still distinct from a fantasy setting. And on top of that, as I mentioned before, Dungeons & Dragons, i.e. the Forgotten Realms, gave them a massive blueprint. They basically had the skeleton of the game already intact because of all the lore and the history that went into the Forgotten Realms. And that's a completely different thing from what they did in Baldur's Gate 3. Now, I tend to be more of a fantasy type of guy, and as I just mentioned, I'm very much an enthusiast of D&D. However, I do like science fiction if it's done right, and I'll be honest, I'm excited for the next title. It'll probably be turn-based again, science fiction. There's almost certainly going to be an early access, so in that sense we will find out more about the game a lot more quickly than with other games out there, and I'm looking forward to it. Anyway, let me know what you think. Are you looking forward to their science fiction game? Do you prefer fantasy? Let me know and I'll check you out next time. But as always, thank you for tuning in, and if you like my videos, you can leave a like, comment, share, and subscribe. It really helps out the channel. Be much appreciated. Until then, take care.